Hello, I'm Charles Clausen, your host of the AMPx Podcast, a show where we engage in conversations with entrepreneurs and innovators whose wild ideas and exponential thinking are reshaping the universe where we live, play, and work. I believe these powerful conversations will inspire you to pursue your dreams. Welcome to the AMPx Podcast. I'm the host, Charles Clausen, and we're very excited today to have a special guest, Travis Ludlow, an adventurer, an innovator, an all-around great person. Travis, in 19 short years, has accomplished more than most of us have accomplished in a lifetime. So I think, Travis, let's start out with your world record and tell our guest about what you did and some of the key learnings along the way.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, and great to talk to you. But yeah, I mean, it's a really long story. I've done a lot of things in those 19 years, but really, I think the pinnacle of it all was my around the world flight. And back last year in 2021, I broke the world record of the first person to fly solo around the world in a single engine aircraft, and that was definitely the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life, but it was absolutely amazing. It took about 4 years of planning and preparation, and against all odds, against coronavirus, against issues with the aircraft, issues with all sorts of things, I managed to pull it off. And well, it was crazy, and I still can't believe that I pulled it off. I look at a map and I think, wow, I actually did that. I actually flew around all the way around that.
Oh, well, awesome. Well, let's start back at the beginning. What events or what happened in your life to actually ignite this seed of, the possibility of flying around the world?
Well, I've always loved aviation. I don't know what caused it. I don't know why, but it was like I was born with a love for aviation. I remember where we used to live. There was a small private airfield here in the UK. And it was right next to our house, and planes would fly over my house all the time when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I used to watch that plane fly over my house all the time and think, wow, that's so cool. I wish that was me. But I never thought I could be a pilot. I thought you have to be rich and famous and all these sort of things to fly aircraft. But every night I would read aviation magazines. I had a pile of aviation magazines next to my bed, and every night I'd read a magazine and think, oh yes, this is so cool, look at all these planes. Actually one day I read a book called Wings Around the World by Polly Vatcher, and she's a female pilot, and she flew around the world a couple times back in the early 2000s, and that's really what gave me the idea. And I never thought about breaking a world record. I never thought about breaking the youngest person world record, but I knew that I wanted to fly around the world. But still at this point, I didn't believe that I could become a pilot. But my addiction to aviation kept going, and I used to do all sorts of activities, and every time a plane flew over, I'd stop what I was doing and look at these planes. And my godmother actually realized how much I love aviation, and when I was 12 years old, well, for my 12th birthday, actually, she bought me a trial gliding flight, and I just absolutely loved it. I remember we went up, the weather was pretty bad, as you know, UK weather, it's raining most of the time. So we went up in this glider. It wasn't raining, but the visibility was terrible. And I just absolutely loved it. And we were only in the air for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but it was enough to make me realize that, hang on a minute, I can go for this. I could be a pilot. And I just absolutely loved it. And from there, I just started doing gliding training. I was every weekend I was down my local gliding club, hopping in aircraft and going up for lessons. And it wasn't long. Wow, it took about 2 years from when I first went up in a glider to eventually, on my 14th birthday, quite a windy day, I flew solo in a glider and that was on my 14th birthday. And I just, I find that was pretty crazy, and I was absolutely terrified. I'm not sure how you'd react. Letting your grandkids going up in a light air, in a glider. That must be quite scary. And so you can realize what my grandparents and my parents were thinking when they were there, thinking when I was going up. But after that, I just thought, wow, I actually want to do something with a youngest world record. And I remember thinking, hold on a minute, I want to fly around the world. What if I break the world record of the youngest pilot to fly solo around the world? And it's actually around this time I read a magazine article, still reading these magazines next to my bed every night. I read this magazine article about a person called Lachlan Smart, and he's an Australian, flew around the world back around the same time I flew solo in a glider, and that inspired me. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be him. I want to beat that record. And that's all how it all came about. From then on, the rest is history. I began to plan and prepare, and I did it eventually.
Awesome. Outstanding. I want to take just one step back. So when you finally had your solo glider flight in the tow vehicle, let go of the cord.
Yep.
What did you feel in that moment when you were free and you were just soaring in the air currents? How did that feel?
It was amazing. I mean, it was freedom, relief. I think. I mean, I was so used to having a bossy instructor in the back, and now here I was up here, and I had all the controls myself. And obviously, I was well trained. And I was sensible, but I had all the control to myself, and I was just having fun up there. Obviously, I'm concentrating still. I'm working out how to land the plane. Because it's a glider. There's no way once you're let go of the towing. Once you let go of the towing aircraft, you're coming down. You're not going back up. And so I was working out the landing, and I managed to do a pretty good landing. But obviously, before I took off, I was terrified. I was really nervous. I'm thinking, I'm going up in the aircraft by myself. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to handle it. There's no one in the back behind me. But yeah, once he released that tow rope, it was euphoric. It was amazing.
So how many hours of training did you have before you actually got to go solo in a glider?
It was just over 20 hours of training in the glider. And I did that over the course of 2 years. So because you can't really go up in the air for that long, especially in the UK where the weather isn't the best. You can't. The average flight time was 20 minutes. So and that was maybe a couple flights a day.
Wow. So that's not a lot of air time. So I can understand why.
Yeah.
At 14, you were a little apprehensive and what's going to happen when you're on your own. Absolutely.
And when I eventually flew solo in a powered aircraft, back when I was around 16 years old, I was a lot less nervous. I mean, that might have been because I'd already flown solo in a glider. I already knew what it was like to be pilot in command, but you had a lot more pressure taken off you because you've got an engine. So if something goes wrong while you're coming into land, or anything goes wrong, you just go full throttle and climb away, or you can stay in the air for 2 hours instead of 15 minutes. So it was definitely less scary doing my first solo in a powered aircraft.
So the first solo glider flight, how long were you in the air? Did you make it 20 minutes?
No, I was in there for a lot less because they can't let you fly for too long, and you can't actually leave the airspace of the airport. You have to stay within the airport's vicinity, within 5 miles of the airport. So they didn't take me that high. They took me high enough that once they let go of the cable, I just glided down downwind of the runway, turned and landed back on the runway. So maybe I was in the air for 8 or 9 minutes, but that was it. But I mean, I think it felt a lot longer than that, just because I was having such a good time.
So then you stepped up to powered aircraft, and how did that training journey go?
Well, because I'd already been taught a lot. Well, what's good about gliding is that you get a lot of the basic stick and rudder skills, because the wings are so long on gliders that if you move the stick a little bit, the plane is quite clunky, and the tail likes to stick out from the big ailerons. So you have to use a lot of physical movements physical body movements to control the aircraft. Whereas moving onto a powered aircraft, it's a lot more sensitive. And so I guess I was so used to making all these big movements, that flying a light aircraft, it was a lot easier because you go slightly a bit to the right and the plane will roll to the right nice and quick, whereas you have to go a lot to the right in a glider in order for it to roll around the same speed. So yeah, I was pretty much straight into it. I mean, I remember I landed it on my second flight or something like that, and I was my instructor said I was not, I wouldn't say a natural, but they said I was a great pilot straight away. So yeah, it helped out a lot, and it was a lot more training to go first solo. I think I did maybe 30 hours or something. Maybe actually, I'm not sure. Maybe it was less than that. I can't remember. But it was a lot more training required in order to go up for first solo, and you had to write an air law exam as well before you go solo. But it was definitely more rewarding, I found, to go solo in the powered aircraft.
So you were 16 when you did your solo in a powered plane?
Yes, and my goal was actually to fly solo on my 16th birthday, but unfortunately it was the weather was terrible on my 16th birthday, so I had to go the day after my 16th birthday. But I still got it done nice and close to my birthday. Just a shame because my grandparents drove all the way down from a town called Ipswich in the UK, about an hour and a half drive from where I was flying out of, and they had to head back for the night and come back again the next day. But yeah, it was great to pull it off, and had a lot of fun. And it taught me a lot about the weather as well because the instructor made me do a briefing with him and talk about the risks and why you shouldn't go up, and do you think you should go up, and I made the right decision not to go up, and yeah, it was a good lesson.
So I guess learning powered aviation in the UK is a good place because Mother Nature's always throwing something adverse at you.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the weather changes drastically. I mean, it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit here today, and then next week it's dropping down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So it goes up and down, and the rain some days, completely dry the next. So yeah, it's strange, but it teaches me a lot because on my around the world flights, there was no weather which I'd never encountered before. So it was all very familiar. But what's also quite good about the UK is that it's such a small, it's a tiny island, compared to the United States. It's a tiny island, and there I am, and there's so many aircraft coming into London. I mean, London has how many airports? You've got London Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton, Stansted. I mean, that's just it. So I think there's 4 or 5 airports going into Londden.
So there's a lot of traffic.
So there's a lot of traffic, and the airspace is really tight. And so that's one of the hardest parts about the UK is the airspace. And so if you can fly here, if you can navigate here, you can navigate anywhere in the world. And that's what made it possible really for me, is that I found it a lot easier. And I was speaking to a lot of pilots who youngest people who had flown around the world, and their stories have come through the UK airspace, and they were like, what is going on? How do I do this? So it was watching their videos and hearing their stories, I'm thinking, oh yes, yeah, I know that.
So the first step was to get your basic pilot's license. So before you could fly around the world solo, what other licensing certifications did you have to pick up to be able to navigate around the world?
So after I got my private pilot's license, I picked up you have to be 17 to hold a private pilot's license, and that's the same here as pretty much everywhere else in the world. And I picked up my private pilot's license on my 17th birthday because I completed all my training before that and all my tests. So I went down to the Civil Aviation Authority's offices on my 17th birthday. I picked up my license, and the next day I had a flight booked out to Phoenix, Arizona, to complete my to begin the training for my instrument rating. And I'm not sure if you don't know what an instrument rating is. It essentially allows you to fly and navigate inside, without reference to the ground, and essentially flying in clouds and bad weather, basically. So you're flying with reference to your instruments, navigating with reference to your instruments, and that's vital for an around the world flight, because you're flying in places where the weather can just change like it does in the UK. And the only the bit that's a bit more difficult is that in the UK, if if you don't have an instrument rating and the weather suddenly turns bad, you just land at any airfield because they're dotted everywhere around the country. Whereas flying in Siberia, the weather suddenly turns bad. You're not landing the plane for another 5 or 6 hours. So it was absolutely vital to get that rating. And I did that with Aeroguide in Phoenix, Arizona. And Phoenix, Arizona, I mean, it's not the best place to get that rating, to an instrument rating, flying in bad weather, because it's sunshine for like 364 days of the year over there or something. So it was not the best place to go, but well, for actual practice. But it was good to get that rating, and it was vital. As well as that, I also did some survival training and ditching training. So what to do, how to land an aircraft in the water is what I also did a lot of training on. The problem was I was actually supposed to do some escape training. So, how to escape out of the aircraft once I've landed in the sea. But unfortunately, this was around the coronavirus time. I wasn't able to, it was all during lockdown. I wasn't able to go to the pool and actually practice these things. So I missed out on that. But luckily, I didn't have an engine failure over the water, didn't have to ditch. So that was quite lucky. But I was also due to do some mountain training, so mountain flying training, because on my round flight, I flew in a lot of mountainous areas, the Ural Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the Pyrenees, just to name a few. So this was important because there's lots of extra risks, encountered around high terrain, around mountains. But unfortunately, again, coronavirus just caused too many issues, and it caused things to get in the way of this training, and I had to put it on the back foot. But that caused a lot of issues. Well, not a lot of issues, but caused quite a big issue later on in the journey. And I'm sure we'll get back to that in a bit. But it was definitely something which I wish I could have done. But other than that's all the training I had. I had a night rating as well, so it allowed me to fly at night. But and that's all the training I had.
So does the instrument rating, does that include radar, or just using the elevation and longitude, latitude, and those basic?
Yeah, so it's a lot of it is that. I mean, radar would be part of, if you're flying an aircraft with a radar, they'd train you on it. But I didn't have a radar on my aircraft. But it is a lot of navigating with longitude and latitude, especially over rural areas like Siberia, like the North Atlantic, where there's no points you can reference yourself off. You have to read what you have to tell air traffic control the coordinates where you think you are, and read them out to them and navigate via coordinates. So that was definitely a challenge, because I'd never actually done that before. The first time I'd ever done that was on the around the world flights, so and on the actual legs themselves. But it was so that was quite a good learning experience. But I did that all correct, because air traffic control didn't get mad at me.
So when you're flying around the world, how much time do you spend over open water?
Well, I tried to spend as little as possible. The conventional route to fly around the world, back in 2018, Russia opened up their borders to allow general aviation to fly through their country, to fly into their country, well, from foreign airports. And before that, all pilots who were flying around the world had to cross the Pacific via somewhere in Asia, then to Hawaii, and then onto the mainland US. Those are in the aircraft I was flying, those would have been 18, 19-hour legs, two 18 or 19-hour legs over nothing but water, like thousands of miles away from land. With one engine, if that engine fails, you've got hours until rescue. And that is just not a risk I could have taken. And I was speaking to my dad. Part of the reason, which was convincing my dad to let me do this trip, and convincing my mum and my dad to do this trip, was that I'm not going to be flying long legs over the water and spending as little time as possible. And my dad said, if you have to fly those 2 legs over the Pacific, then you're not flying around the world. And I said, deal, I won't be doing that, and I'll find a way out. And luckily, as I said, in 2018, Russia allowed aircraft to fly into their country, and so I actually managed to cross the Pacific up north via the Bering Strait, so a place called Anadyr in Russia, and then over to Nome, Alaska. And that was only how long was that? That was about 2 hours over water, and there were islands in between as well, if there was an issue as well. And sure, the water's cold. I was flying over icebergs, but it's a lot better than two 19-hour legs over tropical stormy water.
So just out of curiosity, when
Yeah.
you're flying over Russian airspace and you're talking to air traffic control, I'm assuming you're talking in English. Do all of these countries have English speaking people that you can understand?
It's the International Civil Aviation Organization, is essentially states the rules are the international language of aviation is English, and that's how it should be. I mean, for domestic aircraft, for domestic airports, I don't think it actually has to be English, but for international airports, you have to have English air traffic control. And for 99% of the countries I went to, that was the case. All except for Russia, because it's such a big, vast country, and you have all these international airports, but you don't get any international flights. Well, the only time you get international flights are Russian aircraft flying into those airports. So the pilots already speak Russian, and so instead of paying extra money for getting an English speaking controller, they just hire Russian controllers. And the person who was actually helping me out with my legs through Russia, he knew this, but there's only so much he could do to try get English speaking controllers on. So a lot of the time I was actually doing flights into Russia, and I would have to call someone on the satellite phone to translate what the air traffic controllers were saying while I was in flight. A few times I had to think, okay, does that mean clear to land? Does that mean there's an aircraft coming in? And so I was basically clearing myself to land at these international airports, and I was hoping that no police show up, no people with guns, and luckily that never happened. So I got quite lucky. But that was definitely a challenge. Is that, again, if something goes wrong and you need to ask for help from air traffic control, they don't have a clue what you're saying, and so how are they going to know to send search and rescue out to you? So it was scary and a challenge, but it made it quite interesting.
Absolutely, having an international special phone that you could contact someone to translate what you were hearing from air traffic control. Yeah, that's kind of dicey. So when I think about this, your parents gave you some constraints about flying over open water.
Yes.
Tell us about the planning that went into figuring out the route that your little Cessna could make it to the next international airport, and all the logistics. How did that happen?
Well, so as I said, it took about 4 years of planning and preparation, and the route was changing constantly. Even up to the day of my, even during my around the world flight, my route was changing. I would just decide to land somewhere else, or I was forced to land somewhere else. But the planning for the routes, included things like ease of hotels, ease of food to get to, the quality of the airports, quality of the place I was going, how nice it was, if the airport will be open, landing fees, fuel fees, all these sorts of things. And the big challenge was the range of the aircraft. So I did have quite a long range for what the aircraft was. So I flew around the world in a Cessna 172, a 2001 built Cessna 172, and a normal Cessna 172 has a avgas engine, which is essentially petrol, and it has an endurance of about 5 hours, so it can fly for about just over 500 miles, let's call it. But you're basically running on fumes by the time you reach that point. One of the criteria I needed was 1,000-mile range. And what I worked out was that you could actually get engines that go inside these aircraft that only burn half the amount of fuel that the conventional avgas engines do, and they actually run on jet fuel. And there's two benefits of this. So the first benefit is that you get it only burns about 4 gallons an hour, 4 US gallons an hour, compared to 8 US gallons an hour for the conventional engine. But as well as that, jet fuel you can get absolutely anywhere in the world. Everywhere has jet fuel, because you have jets operating everywhere. You have airlines flying into every airport everywhere. Whereas you don't get light piston aircraft flying into everywhere, which is what they typically runs on. Which meant that I didn't actually really have to worry about the logistics of fuel, because I knew 99% of the places I was going, there'd be fuel. As well as that, it had also been tested on running on diesel, and it runs fine on diesel, because jet fuel is basically the same as diesel with some additives to it. And so and there was one time in my flight, I actually landed at a small airport in Russia called well, what was it called? Puskov, I think it. No, was it Puskov? I can't actually. Oh, Chita in Russia. That was the name of the place. And they pulled up in a truck with a big vat of car diesel, a big drum of car diesel, and poured it into the plane, and the plane ran fine for that whole flight. And so really didn't have to worry about fuel and fuel planning. Logistics planning for fuel. And the only place I really had to worry about was Russia, because they have a lot of documentations and things like that. It's whoever's the biggest epaulets on gets to ask all the documentation and things like that. So that's how it works in Russia. But apart from that, food, I brought emergency food with me. So I brought pot noodles. I like instant noodles, British instant noodles. And I bought Jaffa cakes, which are like British chocolate. It's like a mini cake, bit of chocolate on it with a orange sort of inside. And they're absolutely delicious, but they're a British staple, and I love them. Unfortunately, I gave most of mine to some Russian school children who came to visit me when I landed at an airport in Russia. So I lost my stash of those. And I also had some Twiglets as well, which is another British snack, Marmite breadsticks, basically. And so those I love those as well. And I managed to get all the way through my reserves during my around the world flight, and it caused some problems because a few times where I landed and I had to make unplanned stops, because most of my planning was to places where I knew there'd be food and I knew there'd be a place to stay. But there are a few times where I had to stay at places where I had to divert to some strange places. For example, and I'm like, a lot of this is Russia, and again, this happened in Russia. I was flying from Magadan, which is on the far west coast of Russia, to Anadyr, and this was supposed to be my last day in Russia. And I was doing a planned fuel stop in a tiny settlement called Manili in Russia. Now, no roads connecting to this place. The runway is actually a helicopter runway to just give this Soviet helicopter space to take off, and that's the only way to get in and out of this place is by the Soviet helicopter. And Soviet helicopter runs on jet fuel, which is perfect for what I needed. So that was a planned stop, and I land there, fill up with fuel, and I take off again. But the weather had actually decreased quite a lot as I was coming in, because the weather tools that you have for the middle of Siberia, for this side of Russia, I mean, it's pretty terrible. There's not a lot of things that you can actually rely on for weather. And so it was essentially me showing up blind, just not really knowing what the weather was like. As I show up, it's raining, visibility is terrible. But I think, okay, I probably get out of it because it looks like it's clearing up. And as I take off after filling up out of Manili, I see just the base of this huge mountain and nothing else, because the top of it is just obscured by cloud. And my flight path is taking me directly towards that. And I think, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm turning around and landing back. And so I landed back. And this was supposed to be my last day in Russia. I was supposed to be leaving Russia on this day. So I only had about 300 rubles, which is, what is that? I mean, that's like $3 or something like that, maybe even less than that. And I had about $1,500 in my bag. And so I landed there, and they were like, I had to call my translator on the satellite phone. And he said, they're asking why you're here. And I said, oh, the weather's bad. And they said, oh, okay. Well, where do you want to stay? And I said, basically, you tell me. And they managed, luckily, because I only had 300 rubles, which I told them, and they're like, oh, this is not good. This is not good. Luckily, someone had a hostel which they built there. Built this hostel himself, and I remember I managed to spend the night there. He took about $100 for me to spend the night there, And I don't know why what he'd ever use those dollars for, why he'd ever need them, but he took the dollars. And I managed for that 300 rubles to buy a loaf of bread at the local shop. And so that was my dinner for that night, was this loaf of bread. And so there was I was actually the blankets were all Dora the Explorer blankets, which was kind of strange for the middle of Siberia. So there I was sleeping with a Dora the Explorer blanket, with a loaf of bread that I had for my dinner, and took off the next day. And that was the challenge, some of the challenges I faced. And I, obviously lost a lot of weight on my around the world flight, because I couldn't eat properly, just because there was not a lot of opportunities to eat properly. But other than that, the planning and logistics went well. And the only thing I messed up on as well for my planning and logistics was a lot of states in the US, and I didn't realize this, or a lot of hotels, that is that you have to be 21 to stay in a hotel. I didn't realize that. Whereas everywhere else, well, most other places in the world I've ever been to, you could be 18. So there was, I showed up at some of these hotels. The first time it happened to me, I'd actually flown all the way up from, I flown from Seattle down to LA, spent the night in LA, then flew from LA to Las Vegas. I was going to spend a couple of days in Las Vegas, and I get to the hotel and I give him my passport, and he looks at my passport. He goes, you got to be 21 to stay here. And I said, well, I didn't know that, and I just flown all the way from all the way halfway around the world. And he's like, oh, sorry, you can't stay here. So and that caused me quite a few times issues staying in hotels, and I guess that was my bad for not realizing that that was the case. But other than that, everything went smoothly. The planning preparation went well, and it was a good trip.
So when you were going through this planning phase, did you have some mentors that were experienced aviators and had traveled long distances to kind of guide you and teach you about what you might expect? And how did that learning process go?
Yeah, and that's, as soon as I decided I was going to do this, I started contacting people ferry pilots, people who'd flown around the world. Some of the youngest people who've flown around the world, I managed to contact as well. And that was probably the best thing I could have ever done, is the amount of experience they gave me. So, I mean, for example, it was little things that they gave me, and that was quite important, such as wearing epaulets. So I never even thought of this, but they said, imagine you're trying to you arrive at this international airport, and you're just dressed in civvies, it's like just normal civilian clothes, and you're trying to get airside and try at this international airport, trying to pass through, and trying to get onto the apron, and people are going to think, why is there a kid trying to get onto the apron? And they're going to think that's not right. Whereas if you wear epaulets, and they think, okay, this guy must be a pilot, this guy must be must be flying a plane, and so they're a lot more accommodating. And so that's just some of the tips that I hadn't even thought of. And obviously there's tips with the weather, fuel planning, and the person, one of the biggest helps I had for me was someone called Mason Andrews, and he was actually the person who was holding the record. He's the person whose record I beat, and he was absolutely amazing. He was so helpful, and I actually met him on the around the world flight in Louisiana. But he was absolutely amazing, giving me so much tips, so much advice, and it was just great to have so many people who have the experience, and who a lot of people didn't believe I could do it, and rightly so. I mean, there was coronavirus, and they were still giving me all this advice and help for free. So it was a privilege, and really, I mean, it saved my bacon quite a few times.
Well, did you ever think about giving up because of all the challenges that the pandemic was throwing in front of you, or did you just keep going on a singular focus that I'm going to make this happen?
Yeah, well, there were a couple of times where I thought this around the world flight's not going to happen. So the first time, I remember I was coming back from school, and I remember listening on the radio. It said, breaking news. The WHO has just announced that coronavirus is now a global pandemic, and I thought, oh no, there's a trip over. It's not going to happen now. It's not going to be possible. And I remember I was really down for 2 weeks, and I was thinking, oh, this is the worst thing that could have happened. It's not going to work out now. But I remember thinking, so my original plan was to fly around the world in 2020 and beat the world records at 17 years old. And before that, Mason Andrews' record was 18 years and 163 days old. And I was planning to fly around the world at 17 years and 17 and a half years old, basically. And so I was going to absolutely smash the record. I was going to, absolutely beat it by just under a year. And I realized that, hang on a minute, if coronavirus clears up before Mason Andrews, before the age of Mason Andrews, well, a few months before the age of Mason Andrews was for me, I could still pull it off. So I won't be flying around the world at 17. I'll be flying around the world at 18, but I could still do it. And in the end, that's exactly what I did. I took off 6 weeks before. I took off 2 months actually before the cutoff date before Mason Andrews' record, and I landed back 2 weeks before. 2 weeks to spare, 13 days to spare. So I beat the record by 13 days. But that wasn't the only time. I mean, that was time. So I had actually bought an aircraft to fly around the world in, a Piper PA-28, which also had the diesel engine. It was really nice. But I had some issues, I should call it, with the company that was putting the avionics in. It's a really long story, and it's not something I should probably say on here, but I remember thinking, these guys are going to stop the whole around the world flight, and it's all going to be because of this. And this was 2 months before the around the world flight was actually set to kick off. And I thought, these guys are going to stop it. I don't have an aircraft. The aircraft's not airworthy. And so I basically sent out a bunch of emails pleading for someone who could help me. And luckily, I managed to find the head of AOPA France. His name's Emmanuel Davidson. He actually managed to find an aircraft that I could fly around the world in. It was a Dutch aircraft, and the owner was absolutely amazing. He was kind enough and also crazy enough to trust me to fly his Cessna 172 around the world, and that's exactly how it happened. And I only got the aircraft 10 days before I took off the around the world flight. So I only had 10 days of experience and practice flying that aircraft before I left for the trip, which was not long enough at all, and it was quite silly to do that, but and it did cause issues, but I pulled it off in the end.
So Travis, you said he was crazy enough to let you do it. Did he let you borrow his plane, or did he sell it to you, or how did that work?
I rented it off him. So he did it. I did a deal with him to rent it off him to fly around the world. And so I paid for 3 months of rental for that aircraft, and that's how I did it. But I mean, obviously, it's renting an aircraft to fly around Europe is different to renting an aircraft to flying around the world. So he wasn't doing it. He wasn't doing it for the money. He was doing it to help me out, and he was doing it because he trusted me to take his aircraft around the world.
Well, that's a beautiful thing, and I think a lesson for everybody, that if you're willing to ask and reach out, the kindness of strangers can change your destiny and your life in many different ways. But you just have to open up and ask and see what the universe sends back. So that's pretty cool.
Exactly, and that's essentially how I made the around the world flight possible. Is that I just asked. I would spend nights every day after school. I'd come back from school with help from my dad. We'd write emails out to marketing directors and CEOs and people who wanted to donate, and I just wrote all these letters out, hundreds and hundreds. Even the night before I took off the around the world flight, I was writing these. And 99% of them just flicked it off and said, no, or didn't even respond to the email. And that 1%, that the kind 1%, the people who actually trusted me and believed in me, were the people that made it possible. And I'm forever thankful. I mean, they changed my life forever, and they're just absolutely amazing people. And that's, I think, if you're ever in a position to help someone out, I think you should always go for it. Just you never know. What you're doing and what position you put them in, and how much it will mean to them. So that's it was absolutely amazing, the help I got, and I'm forever grateful.
Well, that's another great lesson, the persistence to continue when things look the darkest, and keep showing up and keep asking, and eventually, it all came together. So
yeah,
how did you go about finding sponsors to help fund this around the world adventure?
So there's some interesting stories actually how I did this. Yeah, as a lot of it was just reaching out to people who see want to come on board. I reached out to so many companies, and there are people who see my social media and reached out to me. There are people who reached out to my dad. Actually managed to contact my dad. People who just knew who I was and passed my name along. Obviously me writing emails. And that's essentially how I did it, was just asking for donations, asking people to sponsor me, and I raised quite a lot in sponsorship to make this possible, and that's how I did it. And it's actually one of the strangest ways I actually managed to raise sponsorship was I was on a forum talking, because I was thinking about, okay, what sort of equipment do I need for crossing the Atlantic, what sort of things, and I was speaking to someone, and his name was. I won't say the company, but it said the name of the company's CEO on was his tag on this aviation forum, and I thought, oh, that's cool. I wonder if he's a CEO. I was privately messaging him, and it turned out he was a CEO of this big company, and I told him what I was doing, and he was like, wow, you should contact my marketing team and all these sort of things. And in the end, I contacted the marketing team, and they said, yes, let's sponsor you. Let's raise all this money. So I essentially was just chatting to some guy on the internet, and he was CEO of this big company, and he actually sponsored me on the round-off flight, because it turned out he was a pilot as well. He'd been doing a lot of cross-channel flights, and he knew a lot about this equipment he needed, and he sponsored. Company sponsored me for my flight, and so that was another amazing thing, which I'm forever grateful for, and the kindness of him, and I guess he was inspired for what I was doing, and I guess it shows that things just sometimes fall into your lap and make it possible. So, and that's what I think a lot of around the whole flight was insane luck. That's really what made it possible, was luck as well, and that's. That was one of the things, was just the luck of that.
Well, having a clear intention, and it sounds like the social media and the aviation forums allowed you to really expand your reach and touch a lot of people and get them engaged in your journey.
Yeah.
So you've gone through the prep work, you've got the plan in place. Before we start, if I recall correctly from the TED Talk, you flew the slowest plane that's ever flown around the world, and you beat the record by 13, 15 days or something like that. So how does that all work?
So I was, again, as I said, I was very, very lucky. Most of the delays are from around the flights are weather and politics and things like that. And for me, there was a gap. It was COVID was wearing off. And this was before, it was just after COVID was wearing off, and this was just before the whole Russia-Ukraine situation. And so there was no really political issues. I only had one sort of political issue, which was to do with Canada. They were still quite tight with their lockdown, and I was forced to actually divert due to some weather into an airport in Canada, which was supposed to be a domestic flight flying from Alaska to Seattle. But the weather was quite bad, so I was forced to divert into Canada, and I was actually quite delayed quite a bit, because they had to politely reject me entry into the country, and I had to continue on my way to Seattle. I mean, in the end, that didn't cost me a day; it just cost me a few hours. But that was the only political really issue I had. And in the end, I only was delayed by 2 hours. Not 2 hours, sorry, by 2 days on the whole round-the-world flight due to weather, which was. Really, really lucky. I pushed it hard though. I mean, I originally planned to fly 4.5 hours a day, and after doing a couple 4.5 hour days, I was thinking, this is too easy. I mean, I wake up early in the morning and I land mid-afternoon, and I've got the whole rest of the day doing nothing. So I thought, I bump this up, and in the end, I was doing it 8-hour days, and that was fine. And I mean, it was tiring, of course, but that's what made me do it the fastest. I mean, originally I didn't think I'd do it. I thought I did it joint the fastest. So Matt Guthmiller, he was another youngest world record pilot, and he used to be the fastest. He did it in 44 days, and I thought it did it in 44 days until I realized that, hang on a minute, I crossed the international date line and went back in time a day, so I actually did it in 43 days. And so that's how I realized I did it the fastest, and so I only beat it by a day, the fastest record of the youngest pilots. And yeah, I was just so lucky. I had no issues with the aircraft, no issues getting fuel, no issues with weather, no issues with politics, and that's how I did it the fastest in the slowest aircraft.
You mentioned that there was times when you were going 8 hours that you got tired. Was there ever points where you felt like you just couldn't keep your eyes open, and how did you work through that?
Yes, yeah. One of my scariest flights, and this actually links in with what I was saying earlier. When I got kicked out of Las Vegas because I couldn't stay in the hotel, any of the hotels. I had to leave Las Vegas. So the flight was actually, so I'd flown down from Seattle down to LA the day before, and that was supposed to be an 8-hour flight, but I did a stop halfway to look at the aviation museum, and I ended up staying there for quite a long time, this aviation museum, just because I had such a good time there, and it was good to have a little break. I was there for about 6 hours or so. So in the end, I only landed in LA around 3 a.m. or I mean, it wasn't 3 a.m. It was 2 a.m. I only got to sleep around 3 a.m. But the thing was, I had media commitments at 7 a.m. at a different airport. So I had to get up at 6 a.m., get to the airport, flew the short hop just the outskirts of LA, and did these media commitments. I was still quite buzzing because I just woken up, done all the flight planning and things like that. But after the media commitment, it was about midday by this point. No, it wasn't about midday. It was about 9 a.m. by this point, and it started to heat up. The California heat, California desert heat. It was making me quite tired. And I had a 2.5 hour flight from that airport to Las Vegas. And I remember I took off and I put the autopilot on. Once I flew out of the area and the workload decreased, I put the autopilot on, and I was just sitting there, and I was starting to go dip my head and close my eyes, and I realizing I was falling asleep in my seat, and I was slapping myself in the face trying to stay awake. And I had an energy drink, which I vowed not to do because, well, first of all, I hate energy drinks, but also it makes you pee, which is not what you want to do when you're in a toilet with when a plane with no toilet. Luckily I managed to make it to Vegas just in time, get to the hotel just to be kicked out of the airport, kicked out of the hotel. And so I thought, okay, well, I've got nowhere else to stay except for my next destination. But the problem was my next destination was in Montana. And so that was another 8-hour flight all the way up to Montana from Las Vegas. And so I thought, okay, if I just drink energy drinks, had these bags which I could pee in, was sort of what diapers are made out of, and absorbs it all. and that's what I thought I'd do. And so I took off on this flight, absolutely exhausted. I mean, I knew I was exhausted. I mean, it was so hot as well. I mean, it was 110 degrees, and I knew it was quite scary because the air traffic controller cleared me for takeoff, and he wanted me to do a right turn out after departure. And I think, okay, yeah, right turn after departure, I'll do that. And I take off. And as I take off, I just turn left out of departure, just because I was so frazzled and tired. And he was like, that was supposed to be a right turn. You did a left turn. I was like, oh, sorry. And I continued on the flight. And by this point, I left Las Vegas around 6 p.m. Bearing in mind, it was an 8-hour flight up there. I'd only be getting up to Montana around 2 a.m. And I'd woken up. And I remember I'd gone to sleep the night before around 3 a.m., woken up at 6 a.m. So I was on about 3 hours of sleep, and I was only going to get to my destination at 2 a.m. So it's going to be about an 18-hour workday for this whole flight, for this whole day. And so I links in again to what I was talking about, how I didn't have any mountain training. So remember I told you I was saying that I was going to do some mountain training, but I never managed to pull it off. Well, Montana, as you know, it's surrounded by the Rockies and surrounded by all these huge, huge mountains.
Right.
And as I was about an hour away from my destination, so it was about 1 a.m. local time at this point, pitch black outside, starting to get a bit tired again. The energy drink's starting to wear off. As I'm flying along, I'm listening to music to try to stay awake, while also listening to air traffic control, of course. I begin to notice I'm sitting there with the autopilot on pitch black outside. I can't see the ground below me, and I begin to notice actually that the airspeed is beginning to drop. I'm thinking, that's strange. So I go full throttle, and the airspeed is dropping and dropping still. Instinctively, I turn off the autopilot and I take control of the aircraft, and I'm managing to have to pull back on the yoke in order to maintain my altitude, which was causing my airspeed to decrease. And eventually, I was actually forced to put the nose down and put my aircraft into a descent in order to stop the aircraft from stalling, which would basically cause the aircraft to fall out the sky uncontrollably. One thing to bear in mind is that it was 1 a.m. over the Rocky Mountains. I was on 3 hours of sleep after already flying for 17 hours. I was flying at 14,000 feet, which is above, which is at that altitude you can get hypoxia. And so I was breathing through an oxygen tube. There I'm dropping out the sky. And I was flying at 14,000 feet, and the mountains below me were at 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet separation is the minimum safe altitude. It gives the minimum clearance you can have.
You mean the mountains were at 12,000 feet and you had
right.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I just started to descend because the plane was starting to because the plane would have stalled if I didn't. And I actually dropped about 2,000 feet in 30 seconds. So in 30 seconds I dropped down to the same altitude where there are mountains, and it was pitch black outside, so I couldn't see the mountains or the ground below me. I just knew that I was where the tops of the mountains were. Part of our training here in the UK, pilot training, you get taught a phrase which is aviate, navigate, communicate. And so what that means is you aviate, which means you fly the plane. You navigate, you work out where to go, and you communicate. You talk to air traffic control. And that's what you do if you're ever in a panic or something's not right. And so that's exactly what I did. So here I was descending into the mountain, into the face of a mountain, which I knew I was about to hit any second now. And I thought, aviate, navigate, communicate. So I aviated. So I just turned around the complete opposite direction I was heading. I navigated. I aviated. I turned around. I navigated. I flew the complete opposite direction I was heading, and I communicated. And I told air traffic control what was going on, and they actually gave me directions to get out of the area. And I managed to make it to my destination an hour later. And you're probably wondering, what was that? Why did I drop out of the sky? Essentially, what it was a something called a mountain wave. Which is what happens is you have a mountain, essentially. Imagine a mountain, and that mountain acts like a ramp for the wind. And so the wind ramps up this mountain, but of course it has to come back down. And so it drops down on the other side of the mountain. And I was flying through that wind that was dropping down on the downwind side of the mountain. So it was essentially pushing me down into the face of the mountain. And that's what. That was absolutely terrifying, and that's what it was. And I should have known. I should have thought that's what it was. But because I was so tired, because I was just so many things going on, I just thought, the weather looks good. There's nothing. And coming back to think of it, there was quite obvious signs of high, strong winds over the mountaintops, which are things that us pilots are taught to look out for. And I just never thought of that just because I was so tired. So. I landed safely, but I learned two things that day, which was don't fly for that long, and don't make yourself tired, and otherwise you make mistakes, and also don't fly over the Rocky Mountains in the middle of the night.
Do you have any sense, Travis, how close you got to meeting the side of the mountain? Was it you a half a mile away, or
so in the end, I looked back on my track, and because I had a GPS track of where I was, and 3D track, and I could see the terrain below me on this 3D tracker. So this was after I landed, I looked at it, and I was actually still about a few thousand feet above the ground, maybe I think about 3,000 feet above the ground. Considering I was dropping about 2,000 feet every 30 seconds. I mean, I was 45 seconds away from crashing into the side of this mountain, basically, if I hadn't have turned around. So yeah, that's how close it was.
Wow, that's exciting. I'm sure the adrenaline was pumping.
Yeah.
Let me, so just out of curiosity, once you got on the right track and air traffic control had you on a safe course, what did it look like at 12,000 feet in Montana on a clear night? What did the heavens feel like, and what was that experience like?
Well, I mean, that was nothing. I mean, I had no reference to the sky, no reference to the ground, because where I was, it was so abandoned. I mean, there was a few dotted lights everywhere, every once in a while, but really there was no roads or anything in that area where I was flying. And it was overcast, so I couldn't see the night sky. So really, it was if I looked out the window, I couldn't see the difference between the sky and the ground. So
it was an over. So you were in the partial or clouds of some sort.
Yes,
so you couldn't
yes.
see the heavens above.
No, I couldn't. So, and that's what made it even more scary, was that it didn't even have the moonlight or the stars to reference off of, and so it really was flying blind.
So when you landed that evening or morning, did you take a day off, or did you just sleep for a few hours and get up and head on again?
Yes. So I and that's what I promised I'd do. After that, I was like, oh, I need to get back on my sleep. I can't be tired for anymore. And so I went to sleep around 3 a.m. and I woke up around 6 p.m. the next day, and had dinner, which was the same as breakfast, and went back to sleep a few hours later and slept until 9 a.m. So I spent a whole day asleep, basically, and then I spent another day looking around, how relaxing, and then the next day after that I left. So I spent 2 days there to catch up on some sleep and relax a bit, and then I continued on. But leaving there, I flew over the Rocky Mountains in the day, and didn't encounter any of the same problems, and I could see where I was going the whole time.
So now you're on the kind of the return leg of the trip. How many more days did you have left, and what were kind of the exciting points and lessons learned on your way home?
Yeah, so by that point I had about a month left to go on the trip. It's about a month left to go on the trip. And the things I'd learned really were don't rush. If the rushing had caused problems. I had actually had a scary fuel moment back in Russia. It was actually day 3 of the trip. I was flying from Moscow to a city called Yekaterinburg in Russia, which is actually the 3rd largest city in Russia. I'd never even heard of it before I was applying for this around the whole flight. But it was an 8-hour flight, no longer than 8-hour flight. It was a 8-hour 45-minute flight to Moscow to Yekaterinburg, and as I mentioned, I only had about 10 days of experience flying this aircraft and getting used to this aircraft before I left for the round-off flight. And this was on day 3 of the round-off flight this happened. So I was flying from Moscow to Yekaterinburg, and because it was quite a long flight, my plane had an endurance, well, I thought an endurance of about 10 hours, the flight itself was going to be about 8 hours 45 minutes. So I was pushing it to the end, near the edge of its range, really. We're filling the plane up with fuel. The Russian fuelers are filling the plane up with fuel. And what I didn't realize, because I'd only had about 10 days of experience with the plane, is that you actually have to fill the plane up. It's the same as a car. When you fill up the fuel tank. Yeah, if you allow the fuel to settle a little bit, you can add a bit more fuel to the tank. All the fuel tank calculations were considering an absolutely full fuel tank, and an absolutely full fuel tank you can only get by stopping fuel, letting it settle down again, adding more fuel, letting it settle down again, adding more fuel, letting it settle down again. And I didn't know this, so we filled up to the top and put the lids on, and I put the caps of the fuel tank on, and not realizing that there was an extra hour of endurance, an extra hour of fuel I could have fitted into the aircraft. So considering it was an 8-hour, 45 minutes flight, the plane only had an endurance of 10 hours. And I'd knocked an hour off that because I completely messed up with the fuel. I was cutting things really, really fine.
So you had 15 minutes of safety fuel.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and the legal requirement is 45 minutes is a legal requirement, but that's still nothing for Russia because the nearest alternate airport from Yekaterinburg was a 2-hour flight away. And so I take off for the Iranov flight. I take off from Moscow again, not knowing that my fuel tanks aren't full to the brim, because the fuel tanks actually read full. They're not accurate at the fullest. They're only accurate at 0 essentially. That's the only time fuel tanks have to be legal to read accurately, which I think is crazy. And so they read full. And as I take off, because it's actually an uncontrolled airport in Moscow, I had to circle for about 45 minutes in order to get my clearance to fly through Russia. And so after 45 minutes of holding and just flying, finally I continue on my way. And I realized, okay, I've got 10 hours of endurance, and it's an 8-hour, 45-minute flight. And actually, I also looked at the weather, and a tailwind was forecast. So really, I'll get there with more fuel than I expect, with higher safety margin. So I continuing on the route, and as I climb up to my altitude, I notice I've got a bit of a headwind, and I'm thinking, this is strange. I calculate it, and I realize I'm still going to make it there just with enough with enough fuel, with fuel and a good buffer margin. But the headwind gets stronger and stronger and stronger. I'm thinking, this is quite strange. It's quite tight. I'm looking at a reference to the fuel tanks now, because the fuel tanks are getting more and more accurate. I'm thinking, okay, I've got this much fuel, and I have this headwind. Something's not right. My fuel calculations aren't right, Sam, or there's not enough fuel in the tanks. I did have an alternate I could have flown to. I did have an alternate halfway through, which I had plenty of fuel to get to. But the problem was that it was a Russian Air Force base was my alternate, and flying a American registered aircraft with a British pilot with a massive British flag and European Union flag on the tail. That's not the sort of aircraft you want to land at a Russian military base. So I thought that's really the last thing I want to do. So I'm continuing onwards, and luckily I start to gain a tailwind, and the tailwind actually becomes a lot stronger than was originally forecasted. And so I land, but my final request for the air traffic control was that I request that I could go direct to the runway and make a left turn onto the runway, because what was actually happening, and I've got a video of it, is my right fuel tank was at this point completely bone dry. There was absolutely nothing in my right fuel tank at all. And my left fuel tank had about less than a gallon in there. It had it had 1 gallon in there really. So what that meant was 1 gallon is below the usable level of the fuel tank, which means at certain altitudes that fuel won't actually reach the fuel intake to go into the engine if you're like turning at all. And so I knew that because so I got the fuel tank misrounded. So it was the right fuel tank was dry, and the left fuel tank had the 1 gallon in. And so I had to request a left turn onto the runway, because my right fuel tank was my right fuel tank had 1 gallon in it. And so if I turned right, so if I turned left, that right fuel could supply to that fuel, to that intake all the time. Whereas if I turned right onto the runway, like they wanted me to originally, all that fuel that was in that tank would go to the other side of the fuel tank, or wouldn't get supplied into that fuel intake pipe. And I landed just in time, and I get out and I look at the fuel tanks. My legs shaking. I'm like, oh my god, what just happened? I get out and I look at the fuel tanks, and the left fuel tank was, as I said, just completely bone dry. And I looked at this, I've never seen a fuel tank like that before. I mean, it looked like the fuel tank would just come straight out of the factory and put into the plane. And it was the first time it was about to be filled up with fuel for the first time. Like, it never had a drop of fuel in there in its life. And the right fuel tank just had a few little puddles dashed around the bottom of the fuel tank. And so I've never flown a plane to that minimum fuel before. And yeah, I worked it out that I had 15 minutes of fuel left when I landed, which was just about what I would have calculated. So all my calculations were correct, and all that sort of thing. The only thing I messed up on was not putting enough fuel into the tank straight away. And I realized that after that, that was the issue. And after that as well, I didn't go on any flights longer than 8 hours after that, just because I was too scared.
So that was another valuable lesson learned.
Yeah.
Did you have any other close encounters like that?
So that was the only close encounter I had with fuel. I had and as I mentioned, the close encounter I had with the Rocky Mountains. I actually had a close encounter flying into Seattle. Nothing to do with actually flying the aircraft. Nothing happened wrong in the flight. But this was that same day where I was telling you I had to divert into Canada, and I had these political problems. So I was flying from, as I said, Alaska to, I was flying from Ketchikan, Alaska to Seattle. And because it's only a domestic flight, you don't have to go through customs or anything. Even though you overfly Canada, you don't have to go through customs. And so I was flying to a non-customs airport originally. And as I was looking at the weather and as I was doing the flight planning for that day, I was looking at the weather. And I could see that there was a headwind for that flight, which basically means you fly a lot slower. The flight will take a lot longer than that it will take. But what was originally going to be a 4 or 5 hour flight, I calculated it was going to be a 6 or 7 hour flight. So that's still well within my range. And I thought, okay, it's going to be a longer day than it normally is, but that's it would have been. But I'll still make it there, no problem. So I take off. And I actually noticed that the headwind is a lot less than originally forecasted. So I'm thinking, it's gonna be great. I'm gonna get there, within 6 or so hours. So you're knocking an hour off the expected flight time. And I end up flying through this snowstorm. And as I get out the other side of the snowstorm, the headwind suddenly increases rapidly. And in the end, I'm only doing about my speed along the ground originally goes from about 100 knots down to about 25 knots, which is about 30 miles per hour. So the cars below me on the highways were going faster than I was flying through the air. And so I was forced to, by this point, the airport in Ketchikan had closed. And so I was forced to actually divert into Canada without doing any prior clearances, paperwork, or anything. I just diverted and landed into Canada. And so I landed in Canada around 6 p.m. and in this quite rural area in Canada. And I fill the plane up with fuel, and I call the customs and the Canadian customs. And I'm talking to them, and they say that they can't let me into the country because of coronavirus. And I remember they said to me, they said, "Oh, what you're doing is really irresponsible. It's quite silly to be flying around the world during a global pandemic." And I thought, "Oh yeah, sorry, it won't happen again." But typical Canadians, they're so polite and they're so nice that they can't just say leave the country now. They have to do a formal rejection from the country. So they have to say officially so I have to wait for 3 hours on the ground to get my official clearance out of Canada. And so I'm thinking, oh, now, okay, finally they let me leave out of the country. And so it's about 8:30 p.m. I was able to leave. And as I'm looking for a place to land, I was now to land at an airport with customs. I didn't want to land at Seattle International Airport because it's quite expensive landing fees, and it's a big airport. And I actually find Everett or the Boeing field, which is the Boeing factory in Seattle, and they have 24-hour customs there. And I'm thinking, great. And it's about 8:30 p.m. at this point. I noticed that as I'm looking at the documentations, I see that their office is open until 9 p.m. So I thought, okay, because you have to call ahead in order to get your clearance, in order for them to say yes. And so I give them a call, and I get no response over the phone call. I called them maybe 4 or 5 times, and I get no response over the phone. So I think, oh no, this is not good. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna take off, and I'm gonna arrive and see what happens. And so I get there. I land in Seattle about midnight at this point, and I ask air traffic control where to taxi to get to the customs. They tell me where to go, and I see the customs building, but all the lights are off. It's pitch black, and there's no planes parked outside. But I see a building connected to it with all the lights on and loads of planes parked outside. I think, oh, that looks like the right place to park. So I'll just park right there next to it. And as I get out the plane, I'm getting all my stuff out. A police car comes around, all its lights on, and this guy jumps out his car, and he's got his hand on his gun, and he's saying, "You're going to go to jail tonight. I'm going to take your license away. You need to go over here right now." And he makes me taxi the plane all the way to actual customs area. And he gets out, and he's like, "I need all your bags. I need all this." And he checks all my bags, looks at everything, and in the end, he realizes that I'm not a Canadian drug smuggler, and he becomes the nicest guy. He's like, "Oh man, I'm sorry about that. That's just what we've got to do. Just make sure you got to park over here next time." And they said, "Where?" He said, "Where are you staying?" "Oh, I'm staying in this motel down the road." He's like, "Oh, really? There's a really nice pizza place down the road. I recommend you go over there." So in the end, he became a really nice guy. But you know, half an hour before that, he was holding his gun, threatening to take my license away and take me to jail. So that was definitely a scary moment.
Did you have any other moments where you've had a lot of kindness that people have offered you? Was there any moments where you ran into just a dark person who was trying to take advantage or trying to take something from you or anything like that?
No, I never encountered any sort of any issues with any people. I mean, you know, the worst issue I had was that really with someone, and that was sort of my fault. Really, my biggest worry of the round the world flight was through Russia, and I was warned about flying through Russia, saying, "Oh, you know, so you got to lock everything all the time. You've got to be really careful of the people, all that sort of stuff." And I couldn't believe how wrong that was. I mean, every single place I went to, they were so nice. They were, you know, like, "Hey, great to meet you," and they gave me loads of gifts. They gave me actually, I came into Russia with nothing, and I actually left Russia with two massive bottles of vodka, which was just gifted to me. The people there were just absolutely amazing. Some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life were from Russia. They kept wanting to get drunk with me. So in Russia they have this thing where they flick their neck like this, and that's basically means they want to get drunk. And I was like, "No, niet, I'm flying tomorrow." But so I never had any bad moments with anyone, or any moments I felt threatened or anything like that. I mean, I was very, very lucky.
Oh, that's nice to hear. I mean, it's nice to hear the stories of all these generous people that helped you along the way. So when you got home, what was the reception like, and what did that feel like?
Oh, it was great. I mean, it was a massive relief to arrive, but I landed there, and there was just huge crowd at the airport waiting for me. My friends, family, people who I'd never met before had showed up as well. People who just following my story were there, and I met them all, and it was just absolutely amazing. Just to see the support after doing all that and having all these people there, they give me gifts and all these sorts of things. It was just such a reward. And actually, as I came back into British airspace, my mates who fly as well, we all formated. We all flew in formation down to land at my destination airport, and it was great. And I remember, I landed back, said hello to everyone, and left, and actually had went to a restaurant with my family when I got back, and I was falling asleep in my as I was eating my food at the restaurant with my family, just because I was that exhausted. But yeah, it was such a relief to make it back. The next couple of days after I was landed back, I was back in the air, and me and my girlfriend flew down on holiday down to just the south of the UK for a little holiday. So that was a good reward as well. But back the plane was still full of stuff, full of survival equipment, and we both went flying down for a little holiday.
So you completed this 4-year journey. How did your life change, Travis? What kind of recognition did you get? Obviously, the Guinness Book of World Records is the youngest solo around the world flight. Did the media start coming after you for interviews, and how did the public interest change and what you'd been doing?
Yeah, well, I did. I had a lot of media that came on board. I mean, a lot of the BBC, Sky News here as well, and I did quite a lot of. It was challenging because they did a lot. They want to do a lot of breakfast shows, and breakfast is when huge amounts of people watch. And so I mean, it was a privilege because they're putting me on the main shows. But the breakfast shows, I had to get up at 6 a.m. every day, where all I wanted to do was sleep because I was still jet lagged and still absolutely obliterated with tiredness from this trip. So I had to do quite a few days. I had to wake up early to do these things. But I mean, it was I'm not complaining. It was great to do that, and real privilege as well. But as well as that, the whole aviation community in the UK, I land at airports, and they're like, "Oh, you're Travis Ludlow. You flew around the world. Great to meet you, and it's amazing what you did." And funnily enough, actually, I was actually having dinner with some of my mates at a restaurant yesterday, and the person sitting next to me just comes and was like, "Excuse me, are you Travis Ludlow? Did you fly around the world?" So it was I guess I get a little bit more recognition now, but it was amazing, amazing recognition I got, and I get a lot more support. I'm getting a lot of support, I should say, even now. But I think it changed me as well. It made me a better person. It made me a lot more sensible. I learned a lot about myself, and it made me just appreciate the world a lot more, and appreciate people. I'm a lot more trusting of the world now, whereas I used to think the world was a lot more hostile than it actually is.
Now, you had some experiences in Russia that sounded like they were actually nice experiences, and the people were great. So that's great to hear. I know when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, just touching base late on a Saturday afternoon, you were studying for the highest level of commercial licensing in the UK. How much time does that take? So that means you can fly commercial jets.
Yes.
Once you get through the process.
Yes, absolutely. It essentially allows me to fly any aircraft and get paid for it, but it's really difficult over there in the United States. The FAA has they have the same sort of license, but it's a lot easier to get because it's all based on experience. Whereas, so you have to have 1,500 flying hours and all these sort of things. Whereas in the UK and in Europe, you can get your license a lot earlier with a lot less flying, but the process is a lot harder. And I think the America does it better because you get a lot of experience. But we have to do these 13 exams, of which each are so the shortest ones are an hour, the longest ones are 2.5 hours, and you have to do 13 of them. And I think there's only 2 hour-long tests, and all the rest are two and some are 2.5 hours. So really is a lot of work to get these right, and there all sorts of things. So we got to I can show you actually. We got using things like this Jefferson Airway manual, looking at maps and charts and all sorts of things, which just really difficult things and things that aren't even used today, just outdated. But these things you have to do for your license. So, but it's gonna be a reward to get it done, and it needs to be done. And everyone's on this struggle. All pilots who are going from a commercial in Europe are going through the struggle, and it's gonna be good to get them done.
How many of the 13 exams have you made it through?
Right now, I've only done so I've done UK car, UK. I've only done 3 at the moment of the 13, and the reason for that is because I originally was supposed to do 6, but I caught COVID halfway through that exam week, which meant that I couldn't sit the other 3 exams of that week. So I've got next week, I've got another the other 7 coming up, and then a couple of weeks after that, I'm going to do 3 more of what I missed out on back in.
So you've got 10 more exams in the next 2 or 3 weeks before you head to the US.
That's right. Yes. So I write my last exam on the 19th of August, and my flight out to the US is on the 20th of August.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So we've kind of brought our guest up to speed on your very amazing journey so far, but you're just getting warmed up. So you're heading to Florida, where you're going to start avionics engineering college. You want to tell us where you're going and what that program's about?
Yes. So I'm going to Embry-Riddle Aerospace University, Aeronautical University, and they're in Daytona Beach in Florida. And I'm looking to actually study electrical engineering while I'm over there. But I'm hoping to do a bit of electrical engineering and some aerospace engineering as well. And it's just a great, amazing university. I was actually in New York recently doing a TED Talk, as you know, and while I was there, one of the I was looking for a university, and one of their advisors or their recruiters, I wouldn't say recruiters, but one of their faculty came out to see me and speak to me about the university, and I was hooked. I had to fly down to Florida, and I checked it out, and I just absolutely loved it, and that's how I decided I want to go there. And my dream is actually about electric aviation, and my dream while I'm there is to start a club and start a group, because over in a lot of universities in the States is that your clubs are a lot bigger than they get here. I mean, the universities support them and things like that. Whereas in the UK, I mean, you want to start a club, they're like, shut up. Yeah, there's a lot more. I feel like there's a lot more opportunity over there. And so my goal is to start a club where we get some sort of aircraft. We take out the engine in it, and we put an electric motor and batteries in it, and we could basically convert this existing aircraft to run on battery power. And that's my dream and my goal while I'm there. And my dream actually one day is to fly around the world in a fully electric aircraft as well, break the world record, the first person to do that. So that's my dream someday in the future. You're probably not in that aircraft, but in some sort of aircraft.
Well, that's awesome, and I'm sure you'll make that happen. And I'm sure some of those technologies will come to life before 10 years. When we were at the TED Talk, you talked about climate change and aviation sustainability. And if I remember correctly, you said the aviation industry is the biggest polluter. They put out 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. And one of your passions was to find better ways for sustainable aviation, including electric aircrafts. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I mean, aviation. I love aviation. It's absolutely amazing, but the damage that it's doing is not good. But I'm not saying that we should stop flying. Suddenly we should quit aviation. We should stop flying altogether. I'm saying that we need much more of a push towards the sustainability of aviation. And so at the moment, all aircraft run on fossil fuels, and it's gonna keep going that way, and it has to keep going that way until we find solutions to it. And there are multiple solutions. There's batteries, there's hydrogen, and there's ups and downs of both. So, for example, hydrogen's great because I mean it's very similar to combustion, except the only output of it is heat and water. That's what comes out the exhaust essentially, and you don't have to worry anything about any pollution apart from that. But the problem with it is that first of all, hydrogen is quite difficult to get, the production of it. And also it's extremely polluting, the production of hydrogen. So you have 2 ways of producing hydrogen, which is essentially eco-friendly way and the dirty way. And so the eco-friendly way is it's what's good about it is that it doesn't produce any carbon dioxide or anything as part of its formation of it, but it requires huge amounts of electricity in order to make tiny bits of hydrogen. And as well as that, you can only make small amounts of hydrogen, and so it's extremely expensive to make hydrogen this way. And so it's just not viable to supply an entire aviation sector through hydrogen, green hydrogen. And the only other way of producing hydrogen, which is how most of the world's hydrogen is produced, is a way of actually splitting, creating hydrogen out of gas. And the main, the primary side, the primary deficit of, I guess, of this, the primary problem is that you don't have to use a lot of electricity, you don't have to do all these things, but it just pumps out CO2. That's the main output of this thing, secondary output, and so that's just a huge problem. And batteries, you think batteries are good, except batteries, they right now the technology just isn't there. They could only they just do not have the operational range or capacity to even be close to that of conventional fuels. And as well as that, I mean, they're extremely heavy as well. For example, I was actually flew an electric aircraft back last year when I came back from the underwater flight, and it was it's actually the world's first certified electric aircraft. It's called a Pipistrel, but the problem is that so Pipistrel sells two models. They sell a conventionally powered and a fuel powered one and a electric version. I think the fuel powered one can fly for something like 3 hours, and the electric one can only fly for 45 minutes. And as well as that, the electric one weighs a lot more, has a lot of cooling required, whereas the petrol one can just fly for much further, much longer, and a lot more viable. So there's a long way to go, but we need to keep pushing. Otherwise, we're going to cause irreversible damage to our planet and cause huge issues for the future. And for future generations, and it probably won't affect me, but it will probably start to affect my kids and my grandkids. So it's really something that needs to be sorted out.
Well, I mean, as you mentioned at the TED Talk, that governments and politicians talk about carbon neutral and carbon sequestration and carbon credits, and these were basically marketing kind of gimmicks to appease the people. What we really need to talk about is carbon free and
exactly.
True sustainability. And aviation is always going to be a part of what humans do, and that there needs to be disruptive, truly innovation solutions. And we know that governments are not going to do it. So it's going to be, industry, and it's going to take innovators and visionaries like yourself to make that happen. When at the TED Talk, you referenced a Socrates quote circa 450 BC that he said, "Man must rise above the earth to the top of the atmosphere and beyond, for only thus will he fully understand the world in which he lives." After flying around the world and thinking about aviation sustainability, and there's people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson that are working hard on space travel. Socrates was obviously a dreamer to at 450 BC, thinking about going into the heavens. But how does that touch you, and how do you think about all of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the reason why I quoted Socrates is because I mean that's really what got me inspired into this sustainable aviation. I mean, I had flying around the world, I'd seen the sheer size and the beauty of the world, and once I'd flown up above, flown around the world, and I'd seen it only then did I realize, what needs to be done, and the damage what aviation damage could do to this planet. And so that's really what inspired me. I think we need the big powerful people like Elon Musk and all these people to start and support this goal and make this goal a reality. And it really is the future. It has to be, otherwise there won't be anything left in years to come. And so it's really it's vital that we make this possible, and we change the course of aviation.
Well, I'm sure you'll have a hand in making it happen. So you've given us your 10-year goals. Do you ever have a dream of going to space?
Absolutely. I think space is definitely something I'd love to do. I find it fascinating, and I think it's great that we're exploring out to other planets as well, and exploring out into space. I watched I set a timer recently for when they're releasing the new telescope images. I set a timer to watch that live as they released. So just because I was that fascinated by it. So, but yeah, space travel is absolutely something I'm very interested in, and I'd love to go to space one day.
So one last question in closing. You spent a lot of time training, taking tests to get the next level of licensing.
Yeah.
Spend a lot of time flying. I noticed that you're also a triathlete, a kickboxer, and a wakeboarder. How do you find balance to do all these things, Travis? I mean, you're a busy dude, and you've got a lot going on. So it sounds like you spend some time taking care of yourself, physically as well.
That's how I relax. I mean, is by doing fun things like that. I think it's important to you work hard at things, and you have to relax. If you work hard at things and if you work hard at things you love, then really that's your relaxation, I think. And so that's part of what keeps me going. Obviously there's some things I have to sacrifice. You have to things like I haven't done a triathlon in quite a while, but the kickboxing, I had to stop doing quite a bit of kickboxing just to allow more time to prepare for the around the world flight, things like that. But I keep things in balance all the time as well. At least I like to. But it's definitely been a challenge during these exams to get my commercial. That's definitely been a challenge. But hopefully tomorrow I'll go wakeboarding again, hit the lakes. It's me 100 degrees tomorrow, so I'll have a good time down in the water. And that's it really. Just keep working hard at things you love, and that's what keeps me going.
Well, I think those are two great lessons for all of our listeners. Do the things you love, and play hard, work hard. I did have one other thought that just came into mind. In quantum physics, they talk about the unified field. As you spent hours up flying around the Earth, have you ever felt like there's some higher energy, some higher consciousness, and have you connected with that? And if so, what did it feel like?
I do believe that there is something. As I said, I was so lucky on my run-off flight. I mean, it was a miracle. And I myself, I'm not religious or anything, but I believe that there is something out there. There's something that's watched over me on my run-off flight, and continues to watch out on all of us. And I think that the miracles that came about. I mean, things like the bad weather ahead of me, and just if I just stay on my straight line, there's just gaps in the weather, and these are sort of things that just happen during the whole flight. And things like not getting in trouble, where I could have easily been arrested on that day, or I easily could have crashed into that mountain if this happened, or this or this. But really, I think there is something out there, and something has my back.
So you're heading off to engineering school here in August, and I know you've been trying to raise some money to help pay for that and everything else that you've gotten in your expenses with traveling around the world. You have a GoFundMe account.
Yes.
If someone wanted to make a contribution, how could they do that?
Yeah, so on my GoFundMe account, so if you search up my name, which is Travis Ludlow, you'll see on GoFundMe, you'll see my GoFundMe page, and there you can donate just via that link. And any donations, big or small, just greatly appreciated. And I know times are tough for everyone still because of the impacts of the global pandemic and things like that. And so any help would just be absolutely appreciated. And it's helped me out. It helped me out my Rundle flights. You guys helped me out my Rundle flights, and I asked for some more help for my future. And so again, thank you all so much. And any help will be hugely appreciated, I should say.
Okay, Travis. Well, thank you so much for sharing your journey and sharing your time. I look forward to having follow-up discussions as you progress along the way. This is really exciting. You've done a lot of great things, and I think you deserve a lot of credit, but the real exciting things are yet to come, and how you help create a new sustainable aviation industry. So thanks for everything. This is the AMPx Podcast, and I am Charles Clausen. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for joining us on the AMPx Podcast. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure not to miss future episodes, and please rate the show wherever you get your podcast. Thanks to our awesome production team, Lindsay Soderberg, social and digital marketing, Taylor Higgins, video production, and Seth Nielsen, marketing. See you next time.